Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of 401 Access Tonight. I'm really excited for another fantastic, fun discussion today. This is probably one that many people are going to be really interested in. And my name is Joseph Carson, Chief Security Scientist at Thycotic, based in Tallinn, Estonia. And of course, it's an award-winning podcast these days. So we're really excited to have the award for the podcast. And I'm again joined with my co-host, Mike. So Mike, do you want to give us updates and what we're expecting for the theme today?
Yeah, definitely. So Mike Rowan, VP of Engineering and CISO at Cybrary, based out of DC. Today's topic is a definite spicy one about law enforcement and whether or not there's overreach and what they're able to do. Today, we're joined by Josh Lespinoso, a frequent flyer on the podcast, and definitely somebody who's helped us get that award. So Josh, why don't you give a brief introduction, and then we can just dig right in because I think it'll be a hot topic.
Yeah, no. By the way, what are the status levels for frequent flyer on 401? Do I start do I get like a comfy chair, like free drinks?
Oh, yes.
I think the shared Slack channel. That's
gotcha. Okay. Fair enough. Yeah, Josh Lespinoso. I'm a founder CEO of Shift Vibes, a fleet data company in DC.
Way to undersell it, but yeah.
It's great to be back. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, it's awesome to have you here. And this is a topic that it's been going on since the start of the year, and it all started with the Exchange server vulnerabilities that the attacking group Heffernan did basically went and exploited, many of those vulnerabilities around the world, and basically installed a bunch of web shells that gave them access to those servers. And one of the things that they really, Microsoft released a patch, and people started cleaning up. But for months, the last few months, there's been a number of those companies who were victims that have went, basically, and have done nothing to fix it, have not removed it, and those web shells still existed. And recently, the FBI decided to take a much more proactive approach, and then gain a court order a warrant to be able to go into those exposed companies and start removing the web shells. So there's a big question here, and it's been around the social media and the news have picked up on this about, was it overreach? Were they doing the right thing? And I guess, I don't know, Mike and Josh, what your thoughts are. I waited and took a backseat, and I wanted to gather my thoughts on this. I know my initial kind of thoughts on the privacy and overreach, but I wanted to kind of step back and just take a real understanding about, this is always this question about doing good, versus, is your good intentions, or was your good intention something that potentially, overreached or went into a gray area? So I'm interested, Josh, what has your been initial thoughts, and has it changed over the time that this has been, circulating?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really good framing, Joe. Like, my framework for this is that there has to be some just really extraordinary circumstances for the federal government to be violating the privacy of a private entity. Or to sort of like use force to get into something that they don't otherwise have permission to get into. And for me, I immediately thought of this incident back in 2017. I remember the Mirai botnet, which was basically this really the S in IoT is for security, right? Like these terrible devices that just have all these vulnerabilities. Somebody wrote a botnet to go and basically collect these IoT devices, and in doing so, actually created sort of an existential threat to the internet and its ability to function, because you can generate, even though these devices are like these tiny little whatever, you can generate such massive volumes of traffic by telling them to like focus it on a particular domain or server. And because of that, some vigilante out there wrote a piece of malware where it was basically using the same techniques as Mirai, the exploit, but replace the payload with something that would wipe the device and render it inert, with the thought being, hey, I know that this is certainly a violation of Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Like there's no question about it. But because this botnet created such a threat to the functioning of the internet, and to the community, that the ends justify the means. So to my mind, when I saw the FBI doing that, that was the framework I was thinking about. Is like, well, is this an existential threat to the company, to the either the companies that have been hacked, or to the community at large, that would justify the FBI taking such extraordinary means? And I don't know that it was, to be totally. I mean, where I fall on that is I don't think that the FBI was warranted. Well, literally not warranted, but it wasn't a warranted action for them to be doing what they did.
Yeah. I mean, I think the important part for me, if I can hop in, and I don't know if we covered it really well enough, is that the notification aspect. It's not like the FBI was trying to get in touch, and this was or maybe they were. We don't really, maybe we don't know. Maybe that wasn't reported. But the fact is, they went in and it's notification after the fact. And I think that, to me, is a big problem. That's part of the bigger problem. Is it's one thing to try and get in touch with the owners of these things and tell them they need to deal with it versus going in and fixing it. That's a big aspect. And then the framework under which, like, what are they allowed to do once they're in a network? Like, and we sort of talked about this off, right before we started recording. Like, I don't want to come home to a note from the local police department that says, "Oh, hey, we saw that your back door was broken, so we went in and we fixed it, and it's locked up now. And while we were here, we didn't find anything else, but
we had a cup of coffee and we raided your fridge."
Or like,
but this,
right.
Yeah, but this brings up a really good point, Mike, which is,
or your 14-year-old son is smoking weed, so please bring him down to the police department.
Now, this is exactly where it's like, okay, well, it is very debatable whether the FBI, overstepped its bounds in like using a warrantless approach to getting into these servers. I think all three of us probably, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but all three of us probably think that was a big overstepping of some important boundaries. Now, suppose they were warranted in doing it, right? Now you've got a whole can of worms. What happens if they go in there and they find evidence of a crime? There was no probable cause.
If you have nothing to hide, then why do you worry?
One of the most famous statements of
trigger alert.
Yeah. I actually I just read 1984 again. So just go back some memories. So, but I loved. I mean, one of the when I was kind of taking a step back and was just reading and seeing what was happening, and I completely agree with you, Josh. There's a big question of gray area here, and it's even what you think about, even what ethical hackers and penetrations and security researchers do as well. They tend to get into that gray area as well when they're actually doing vulnerability testing and finding and exploiting in order to do the good thing. But in many cases, they notify the vendors, and they notify. And they give them time in order to fix it. There's that disclosure rate in order saying, here's the time that basically we'll give you whatever, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days in order to fix it. And if you don't, we're going to come back in and we're going to notify the world. And I really loved, it was Yavid Malik who posted, basically when it was happening, he posted a tweet, which was about, it's basically, his bathroom window was a bit broken, and he wouldn't mind if the local law enforcement at some point would come in and with a screwdriver and close the lock. And that was his interpretation of what was happening here. Is that it's basically like law enforcement coming into your home, as you said, Mike, finding something was broken, the door was open, the window was broken, whatever it might be, and they're fixing it from the inside. The whole question for me, after thinking about it, I think the intention, and I think the deed was in the right kind of motive, but for me, it set back and I thought, one is lack of oversight. I always say that the whole lack of oversight is the big issue here, and the second part is that not only lack of oversight, but also that is this the right agency to be doing that? Is it the right people that are one is investigating criminal activities, but at the same time, should there be, the agency for securing things that are not, there for investigating criminal activities? They're there as the part of the cleanup. So the question comes down to is, should the same agency who's doing these cleanup be the same one that's also investigating crimes?
And I think actually on that, I think just keeping it in those real terms, right? If EMT comes in, if an EMT or the ambulance, comes into my house to rescue me because I'm having a heart attack, there is there's no searching, there's no whatever. If they find stuff because they're trying to figure out like, what did I take or whatever, like it's still all outside the bounds of law enforcement because it is not a law enforcement agency. And yeah, I agree. Maybe if it was a different agency, maybe if we had a different group that was responsible for health and human services of like networks and stuff or computer, whatever. Maybe that's the way. I mean, but I don't trust law enforcement to be able to, like, they just can't. It's their mission is to enforce laws. Like it just puts them in a weird position. I'm sure Josh has some.
But it's the
some
notification.
thoughts.
It's the notification and transparency, which is the problem that I think we have with this. It's not, notifying. We don't know. There's been no transparency into what exactly the details are. Mm-hmm. And also, giving people time to fix it, and giving them, the organizations, their own opportunity to do the right thing. And then also, did they leave a note behind saying,
well, I mean, I think
you're welcome.
I think that's the reason we were finding out about it, is because they are, I mean, in the articles that I read, there was definitely notification, but it was all after the fact.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it's an interesting, I keep coming back to this, but it's an interesting issue. This is an Outlook server, right? Which, when you think about FBI is doing investigations of organizations, the emails are just like almost always the smoking gun in like these things, right? I mean, like, you think about Enron, you think about, even I was reading the other day about Under Armour, like pulling forward revenue stuff, like the SEC slammed them, because it's like, so much of our legal code is about what was your mentality when you committed this offense, and your emails that are, as people still don't realize that, emails are postcards, not envelopes. And even more so when the FBI is sitting on the, the Outlook server. So I feel like that is such a crucial like pulse point for an investigation. And the fact that the FBI, without a warrant, was, gained access to these like critical points of what could be an investigation into criminal activity on, how many hundreds, thousands of servers? Like, what happens now if one of these companies is implicated in a crime in the next 18 months? Can they say now, like, hey, the evidence that you obtained was illegally obtained, and now they're like absolved of any crimes? Like, you just opened up a huge can of worms. Like, I don't know how that works.
Potentially even could have actually made many existing investigations could have actually been deemed, admissible in court now. Potentially, they could come back and use that as a, the evidence was planted, or that, this was something that, the attackers have went in and actually planted it themselves. So it's always that, who had the hands on the keyboard. And when you've basically got the security is open, you could actually make it that somebody else deemed or actually did the crime.
Yeah, exactly. And then, like, where does this line of law? I mean, I hate, slippery slope and all, but like, where does this line of thinking end? I mean, as private citizen, suppose there's some, wormable vulnerability. These things have been happening for decades. I mean, the first one was like the Melissa virus, if I remember correctly. Like, the FBI was involved in rolling that up as well, right? So, they have a history of, setting precedents around doing the investigations for these sorts of, cyber crimes, like building worms and stuff. Suppose someone figures out a wormable exploit for like an iPhone or for a MacBook, or now all of a sudden does the FBI have the ability to remotely access millions of American citizens' devices? Like, I don't know. We've sort of opened the door to that being a possibility, and that makes me very uncomfortable.
Well, right. I don't know if this is what but the idea that law enforcement is also using the same vulnerabilities that the attackers are using to gain access. It's like, that also makes me nervous just in of itself. Forget about what their intent was, like the precedent of what is the legal framework under which they can break the law in order to gain access to a network.
Are they going to start patching our systems for us as well? I mean, are they going to take on the responsibility of securing them even further? So, there's two methods of doing this. Is one, you take the responsibility and the action to do it, or basically you work with the legal aspect of things to make sure that people have the accountability and responsibility to do it themselves. And that's the difference. That's what really, we look at a lot of the compliances and regulations that's coming in EU. You've got GDPR, which is really that enforcement. If you don't do it, you'll get a penalty for not. So for companies in the EU that actually don't patch those systems and don't close up the hole, they could be exposed to GDPR fines.
Right. Well,
So
what's
this
funny
is,
is that whole fine thing was one of the first time I read the article. One of the things that came in my mind was in the U.S. and other jurisdictions, if you go to a gas station and run in to pay or do whatever, but leave your car unlocked, you can come out to a ticket in the hundreds of dollars or $25 or whatever, right? Law enforcement was there saying, hey, we have a law that says you're supposed to lock your door to keep it from getting stolen. And you didn't do that. They didn't come in and lock the car for me. They didn't, they didn't open the doors. And I think it's sort of that same thing of law enforcement's role is to enforce laws. If it's fines or notifications or whatever, that's 100%. It's where they start going in that's problematic.
I think that's exactly right, Mike. And, Joe, an interesting permutation of your thought is, well, for all of these, Mike made an observation that basically like math and computer science don't care if you're the police, right? And so like when we build secure systems, they are secure against forced entry, no matter who you are. They don't care. We've talked in a previous episode, and I think on the Cyber podcast, Mike, about backdoors, like a kind of fallacious argument that is, or like, Aaron's kind of engineering endeavor. And so basically what you're left with is if you are a law enforcement or defense kind of function, you have to use the exact same tools, techniques, and tactics as an attacker, a criminal, and it really is just intent, right? So now you've got this interesting problem, because if you are a law enforcement agency that's well funded and you need to gain access into devices that are increasingly more and more secure, you're going to be doing exploit development and vulnerability research, just like 30 years ago criminals were doing. So now suppose you find remote code execution in all modern versions of Windows, for example. What do you do with that? You've just found an issue that could potentially cripple the internet and have reverberations to the economy, right? Do you hold on to that and use that as a special access tool? When you do use that, are you exposing the world to problems because we're increasingly instrumenting our networks? And if some incident responders go back and they're like, oh my God, look at this. This is a problem, for example, hypothetically in the RDP stack or something of a Windows box, totally separate topic. When we saw Eternal Blue, for example, come out, people were attaching crypto malware to those payloads, right? And so how do you as an organization, as a law enforcement organization, balance the risk that you're putting the world at with the tools that you're developing versus your need for forced entry when you need to do it?
I would even argue not even the tools that you're developing, but you now have the knowledge. Forget about whether or not you have the tool and you're keeping in your back pocket. You now have the knowledge that someone else could develop the same exact tool, and we know the majority, so much of this is state-sponsored actors and others who are just as well funded, or criminal organizations that are just as well funded as these law enforcement, to believe that no one else has discovered the same vulnerabilities or is incapable of eventually discovering them is also a problem. So where's your responsible disclosure in that? You found a vulnerability. Aren't you obligated to notify the manufacturer or the
Yeah. So for me, when we look at this, I think that law enforcement, what they should have been doing is notifying regulators for those companies if they were failing. For example, if it was financial, maybe they're failing PCI as a result of this. If it was government agency, maybe it's compliance failure with NIST framework. All of those things. I mean, there should have been a legal avenue. And this always gets into, when we talk about, Josh, you were mentioning, but creating, malicious tools and weapons. I will say that, one thing that I thought a few years ago was quite interesting. There was a whole discussion around encryption, around the use of VPN and end-to-end encryption. And one thing that was really interesting was a lot of countries around the world were looking at banning these tools, banning the use of them for certain areas. And I was getting into that fundamentally is creating an unsecure, world where we're really looking to make it much more secure. We're making it much more difficult for the criminals. But I thought it was interesting because Russia did take a different stance. What they did was they actually made the use of it for illegal activities illegal, which I think is the right approach. I thought it was one thing that they did was that, there's many tools out there that can be used for good or bad. But if you use it for the illegal intentions, then that's what basically is the criminal activity. Not just having it and not, just using it, it's the illegal actions. And I think this is really where it gets into is that, I think this direction we're going to is that you either have to make sure that you fundamentally create the right framework, the right direction, because right now it's a big gray area. And I get scared when we go into gray areas because it could either go to the extreme, meaning that privacy is gone. We're actually getting to a point where privacy is on a thin line right now. And it's actions like these that really kind of start to dissolve it even further. And that's what I'm afraid of. And that's why I always get scared that there's no oversight. It's that separate, there's some type of oversight that represents the citizens to make sure that the agencies, when they're doing these actions, for example, let's say they did go in and to remove the web shell, that any tools, any information, anything that was gathered at that point basically is completely erased and destroyed. That there's nothing that's retained. And we don't know that because there is no oversight. We don't know what else was done.
But you're not going to be able to
had access.
I mean, the fact is you're not going to be able to erase somebody's mind, right? So there's always the possibility that someone saw something. Now they know, hey, we can't use any of this as evidence, like the stuff that we gathered illegally. I watch enough TV cop drama shows to know that, clearly this happens where they know there's evidence of a crime that they can't use and they find some other way to try and get, we know there's a crime going on, so let's go ahead and figure out how we can investigate this under a legal framework. But I think all three of us are it's a very one-sided conversation, right? There's nobody here trying to argue law enforcement's perspective on this or whatever. So for 1 second, I'd like to maybe play devil's advocate, right? So notification, it takes a long time. In the meantime, all these guys are still vulnerable. Let's say the situation is what's happening in between Russia and the Ukraine, right? Russia is, or what's happened in the past where things are happening at a very fast rate. You have a state-sponsored actor going after another country and all of their infrastructure and the rest of it. Is there time to act or notify? Or is it law enforcement? Is it such a fast-moving environment that it justifies, no, we're just going to go in and we're going to take care of this problem for you. We're going to let you know we did this, because if we wait for you to do it 30 days, 90 days, whatever, it's too late. You guys are going to be exploited. So from that perspective, I'm curious what you guys think. I still have my thoughts, but
yeah, I think, when I try to think about the other side of this issue, analogies are always awful in cybersecurity, but I think about something like termites. Okay, so bear with me here. So the only kind of situation where this sort of violating a person's right to privacy and property is kind of justified to my mind is when there's a community effect that outweighs the person's kind of entitlement to that privacy, if that makes sense. And people are going to disagree on where that flashpoint is. But where I think is say you've got a neighborhood and half of the houses have this horrible termite infection, right? But for whatever reason, either the owners aren't there or they can't afford the termite, extermination and all that kind of stuff. The municipal government decides, well, you know what? We're going to tent all these houses and kill the termites, because what's going to happen is they're going to spread, and then we're going to have a huge problem with massive amounts of property damage. You're putting your neighbors at risk by not dealing with this issue in your house, and so we're going to take matters into our own hands, right? That's the kind of nuance that I think these things get a little mushy. So the question is just how much work, to my mind, how much were these vulnerable Outlook servers putting others at risk?
I think maybe a more because I think even that termite's such a slow moving thing, right? Let's say there's a mob. Let's say there's some sort of protest out of control in some, city, and people are running amok. Right? What is law enforcement's ability to defend private private businesses, and can they board up windows to help protect property loss, or I don't know. So maybe that's
or enter into a private property, where a crime is being committed, not by the owner of the property, but by somebody else.
Where a crime is being committed, I mean, that's a different problem, right? Like we have, I think, laws around like if they, I think, but if there's a mob coming down the street and they see that there's a building that doesn't have boarded up windows, they see that there's a jewelry store that's unsecured, and they know this mob might get there.
Right.
What can law enforcement do? Are they allowed to enter that jewelry store and wait, and try and patch things up before the criminals get there?
So do you think this is actually a really interesting philosophical point. So do you think there's a difference in the act that these two scenarios, the FBI going in on a server that is actively exploited? There's a web shell on it. They know
that's true.
There's so they know they see the traffic coming off. They know that there's these things are compromised. Going on, doing remediation, and then patching the machine as sort of one course. And then another one, which is, hey, the FBI or whoever is scanning the internet, or they're using Shodan or whatever, and they've noticed that based on the fingerprinting, those Outlook servers have a vulnerable version, and without any evidence that they're currently exploited beyond the fact that they're vulnerable, going in and then exploiting the server, patching it, and coming off. Like, are those two different situations?
That's true. Actually, I forgot that they were actually already compromised. Yeah, I mean, if the police are going down the street and they see a robbery in progress, they don't have to wait for a warrant to go in. That's a
So, but Josh, I agree with your point though. Is that for me, there's a big difference though. There's a difference between it's the impact. I think this was not a worm. This was not something that was spreading. It's something that people manually went in, did the exploit, and put in the web shell and gain remote access. And it was not something that was spreading further and further, unless basically the attackers will continue to, of course, exploit the vulnerable servers. It's not a not patch it. It's not like a ransomware that basically all of a sudden just started spreading and spreading and spreading and spreading, and you had to find a way to stop it. Just like you mentioned, I like the example with the termites, is because that's something it will continue to infect other companies. This was something that was a much more of a static scenario. Doesn't mean that
a crime in
you're going to patch everything.
But it was a crime. I mean, they saw that it was exploited. They saw that there was a web shell. I mean, I know where I stand, and I don't think it makes that much of a difference to me. I think that there's still the notification route. I think there's still more that they should have done. I think that there is a difference between somebody with a gun in a jewelry store where there's potential whatever versus other types of. I think law enforcement sees crimes in progress all the time that are a little more slow moving or a little less urgent to deal with, and they probably don't use the same tactics. None of us are in that framework that really know what those laws and lines are. But my guess is, I still think it was a little bit of an overstep, but there is something to be said for it. There was some sort of criminal activity in progress that they were potentially investigating.
Yeah. And then, what happens? I mean, it opens up so many interesting questions. There's probably I imagine first year law students think of these stupid hypothetical situations, but what if the police go into the jewelry store where there's an active robbery and they find a meth lab in the back that's completely unrelated to to the robbery? Like, what do you do about that? Like, it's really complicated.
Yeah, but not from even a compliance and legal perspective is that, let's say all of a sudden, I feel an audit. I'm like, well, I was expecting the FBI to patch that server. They patched the other one for me. Why not this one? I mean, it opens a whole thing of mess that we basically, that's a good point. It's like, I'm not expecting, they did the last one. Why should I patch anymore? I'm going to focus my resources on somewhere else because the FBI is going to do it for me. That's the issue, is that, and where's the balance? Who makes the selection? These things should have been something. So, I always say it's the legal aspect, which is basically what influences people's actions. And this is really where it gets into, is that it should have been something that if, it's an opt-in. Do you want us to come in and do it for you? This is a choice. If you don't, we're going to report you to basically audit compliance, who you're going to come back with a major fine. That's really, for me, I think, is the process and the right way of doing it, is basically making sure that there is a framework that actually is consistent, scalable, that will actually work in the future. This just opened up a huge amount of questions for the industry about what happens next.
Yeah, and I think the notion of opting in gives you more opportunity to say, like, yes, if there's an active exploit, I want you to come in. If it's just something that you've noticed where I'm vulnerable, I want you to use my responsible disclosure program that I set up specifically for this, and go ahead and notify me. And then that's the other thing is how does law enforcement sort of disrupt that whole notion, and like what's their role and responsibility in there, and how what's the impact? But yeah.
I remember years ago when this is during my time at Symantec, we had a product that was called DeepSight, and it was part of the GIN network. And ultimately, DeepSight was that you did an audit on a company in regards to the attacks that was attacking that company. But when we actually ran the DeepSight, quite a few times you'd find out that those companies actually had ongoing attacks coming out of their organization because they had compromised machines within, and they were attacking other companies. So you'd actually go and say, hey, here's what's attacking you, but here's also compromised machines on your network, which was attacking these other companies. What would you like to do about it? Is this going to be the same? Is it now going to go even further, that it's not just about companies who are being exploited and have web shells on their Exchange servers, to even companies who's doing DDoS attacks and others? Are they going to come in and are they going to clean up the internet? Is that their agenda and goal? Because this what appears that the motive was is that they're going to start cleaning up the internet. What's the bigger picture here? And I think that's the big question that we really have to get answers to. What is their role in the future of the security of the internet?
I think it's totally right, Joe. And like what I think about, again, like going back to this sort of community framework, because there's almost like an American tradition that like we have a right to be idiots, and so if you're going to do something that's like terrible for you, but it doesn't affect anyone else, generally speaking, like we're okay with that. Sorry, this is like kind of an American centric perspective, I think, for better or worse. But the moment that what you're doing starts affecting other people, as evidenced by sort of the like I'm thinking about masks in public, for example.
I think we're all thinking about masks in public. This
is still an actively debated battleground, but just bear with me here for a second. I mean, I think that when a server is compromised, I think about sort of two different populations of devices and the people behind those devices that could be potentially affected by that compromise, right? This is a terrible pun. I apologize. I know I was talking about termites. I'm now going to talk about gnats without the G. Sorry. So, things that are behind that firewall, things on the LAN now get exposed. So, if you've got an Outlook server that was on a border, there's a possibility that somebody, if it's not configured properly, get DMZ issues or whatever. Now someone could swim upstream and get into your Active Directory and start messing with devices that are on your network. So that's a whole mess. I think that's potentially, depending on the context, a little bit less of a concern because ostensibly that Outlook server is connected to a LAN that's like related to the same legal entity. So I'm like a little less concerned about that sort of community issue there. Where it gets interesting is what you were talking about, G, which is, you've got that server becomes a pivot point now. It becomes infrastructure for the attacker to then go on and attack more things. You might say, well, they're all connected to the same WAN. So what does it matter that you've now got an additional place to launch your attack? Well, you ask any professional advanced persistent threat about how important that is. It's very important. That's infrastructure. So the infrastructure allows you to evade attempts to block traffic, right? As well as to mask your activity so that you can continue to operate securely. And so like the more infrastructure that someone accumulates, the more they can operate with impunity, and there really is an exponential effect. So I can see an argument there that like when you compromise more and more and more servers, it actually does in some sense have like a community kind of ramification, just playing devil's advocate a little bit.
And I think also on that, it's like, so if I'm investigating a criminal organization that has branched out into these places, as opposed to, so now I'm not dealing with the private entities. I'm dealing with the victims, right? But I'm investigating the criminal organization and investigating that criminal organization. I'm finding that they've accumulated this infrastructure all over the internet. What am I supposed to do? How, what's the victim's rights? How do I notify them? Right. What should I patch? There's that stuff. I do think back to that other the framework that Joe was talking about, while while you're talking, Josh, I realized like we sort of do have things in place around what limitations we put on law enforcement. For example, if I'm driving without my seatbelt, I can get a ticket for that. Mm-hmm. And for a long time, you could not get pulled over for not driving with the seatbelt. You could only get pulled over for some other infraction. And then if they saw that you weren't wearing a seatbelt, that was something in addition, right? It wasn't like they couldn't just pull you over just because they suspected that you weren't wearing a seatbelt. They couldn't pull you over just because they suspected this or that. And so I think that's where I want to see laws try and catch up, but I also know that laws will never catch up with technology, and that law enforcement, like we need better frameworks to guide law enforcement such that we don't always need laws that are keeping up, but rather that just more intent oriented things to try and keep them in check and in balance.
Right. I think it's totally right. And then I think the other thing is for us as security practitioners is if we don't want the FBI and all these other organizations to get in our business, we need to make sure that we're building secure systems and that we are building secure good processes to go back and patch things that we find. Because if ultimately, like, we wouldn't be talking about this problem if the original issue didn't occur. And I know that's a little bit of victim blaming. I get it.
Yeah, but there's also, I mean, they're eroding our trust in them, right? I mean, that's part of it. Is like, I would love to have a much better working partnership with law enforcement with regard to cybersecurity.
Bidirectional.
Right. It's got to be this bidirectional thing. And by doing these types of things, you're eroding my trust in you.
It's always been,
right.
It's always been my challenge as well. Everything, when you're working and cooperating with law enforcement, it's always one directional information. Very little kind of comes back, or there's very little bi-directional communication and transparency, which erodes the trust. But it's very different in Europe, though, is that, trust is built and you have to work together and certain things that you can cooperate and collaborate on. I think in the US, though, is that what you do is you rely on the three pillars of government to provide oversight of each other. But I think this is where I see the issue is that oversight there in this situation? Is the oversight is Congress making sure that the agencies and Department of Justice and everything is actually covering and making sure that there is an oversight process?
Well, the answer is no, because they didn't get warrants.
Exactly.
I mean, the judiciary is supposed to have oversight.
I mean, there was a court. I mean, they got a court order, right?
Oh, they got a court order. That's right. I'm sorry.
But they did go through the judiciary. They got a court order.
Correct. In Texas, it was Texas court order that they actually leveraged as part of this. Yeah, and I think there was also another piece is the knock on door scenario. I can't remember what it was. It was one of our previous guests was talking about from the law enforcement side. They have the capability of going in and checking digital equipment with certain circumstances without having a warrant. I think there were certain situations there that they could do it, and I think the court order would give them that ability to carry out their activities.
One of the issues, though, in the U.S. is you have law enforcement at all these different levels. You have local law enforcement, you have state, you have federal, and then you also have jurisdiction shopping. Of course, if I'm the FBI, I know which court to go to get what I want. I'm not going to go to New York or California. I'm going to go to Texas. So I mean, I think that's part of the problem as well, which is there's not enough happening at the top level to govern everything all the way down. And we talked about it in the last recorded, it's not yet published, but the idea that like every law enforcement agency, local police think that they're the sniper, that they're expert, that they're the whatever, and they should be able to, and so I'm worried about the sort of trickle down effect. What does it mean can my state law enforcement agency use the same tactics that the FBI uses? And trust me, I have a lot more faith in the FBI than I do as you go further and further down, because they have less and less funding, less and less capability. Resources are spread thinner and thinner, but yet they will use the same tactics. Law enforcement shares down. There's no problem. I mean, you can see it because police are driving around in tanks. It's like so.
I also wonder as well, Josh, I don't know how many, because right after the whole vulnerability in the news and the 0 day, a bunch of security researcher peers of mine set up tons of honeypots. So the question is that, what was the law enforcement actually patching honeypots? There's a big question as well. There's a lot of people actually set up honeypots in order to capture and gather and see what's happening, so they can analyze the attackers and understand their attack path and techniques. Which is
I going to get fined for my? Do I get fined for having a honeypot?
It raises a big question.
But I mean, the other side of it's true though too. I mean, if you have a honeypot and it gets compromised in some way, is that and it can be used as a reflector or as to attack the rest of again, I have the right to be an idiot. But once it starts impacting other people, maybe it is. Maybe I do. It's on me to say okay, the honeypots that we should be running are only internal to cat. We shouldn't be totally exposing this stuff because it could be used. But that's used for deception.
But using that for deception. Deception is a way to make sure. That's one technique from OSINT side of things, is that you want to make sure that when someone's poking a hole in your network, you want to try and get visibility. And when they're poking a hole, it's typically from the public domain.
Right.
So therefore, you want to make sure that they're actually triggering your alarms that will give you early detection, the ability to make sure that someone's attempting to get through your door.
Yeah, exactly. All I was suggesting was that maybe not that it's a good thing, but at what point does it become I'm not allowed to actually have that early detection. I have to have it further down where it's no longer early detection. It's oh, look, I've become compromised.
As long as it's not doing it, attack back. As long as so here is when we did, it was 10 plus years ago now. This was post Estonia 2007 attack. There's a project called Cyberminds, which is about active honeypots attacking back. That was the gray area. As long as your honeypots are not causing damage to other people's property, it's kind of deemed as okay. You can have
Shouldn't
active
those be
honeypots.
Called beehives?
That's literally, it's the bees that come back and sting you when you disturb the pot. As long as the honeypots are not causing any downstream impact, then you can set them up.
There's a lot of, we should label this podcast cyber insects or something like that. We've covered a remarkable amount of
the cyber bees.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I mean, go ahead.
So what you're saying, Joe, is I should expect to see an APT report on all of the FBI's toolkits and infrastructure that they use to be patching these servers. I hope they didn't reuse that toolkit.
Exactly. So, but I mean, it drives up a whole fundamental thing, is that I think this needs to be brought into the open and have a real discussion in the industry. And I think we can only provide our from a security perspective expertise in this, and definitely having law enforcement in would be fantastic to get their view. Kind of what was the intentions. And even somebody from a legal perspective, and even getting other security researchers who really kind of get into that gray area a bit more to understand about So it really, for me, it was always that it's well, of law enforcement to do it, and it's okay for them, and they didn't need to go through the legal process. What happens is it going back to your Myra botnets? Is it okay for citizens to do this as well? What happens if citizens start going around and using the web cells and going patching your servers for you? This kind of, where's the legal boundaries here? And that's, I think, where we really need to make sure. It's a big discussion we had years ago here in Estonia around the defensive versus offensive capabilities as well. We've had the discussion before around, when you have basically a cyber attack, citizens should not be attacking back. They should basically be helping defend and provide resiliency and provide capability in making sure that you're able to continue operating. You'll have certain agencies, government officials, who can do the offensive side. Maybe they bring in contractors or whatever it might be. But I think this really gets into the same as that what if citizens decide to go back and, start, bricking these machines and start patching people's servers? Is that okay? Where's the boundaries here? And I think that's really it.
If you're in Florida or Texas, I think it's okay to shoot them. I think that's.
Oh Oh, but only if they're in your bedroom. If they're in your bedroom, well, I don't know. States.
No, it depends a little bit by property, but we won't get into all that. But
so it depends where your Exchange server is. I guess if it's in your home or upstairs in your bedroom, then it's a threat to your family.
But no, I mean, there is precedent around that type of stuff about at what point are you allowed to sort of quote unquote fight back and what's a legitimate use of your own force and blah, blah, blah. But I mean, like, I don't want to go down that path. I just think, in talking about all this, I think the real problem area isn't us on the cybersecurity side, educating and doing what we need to do. I think where everything dies, at least in the United States, is in Congress. And that's where all of this stuff, and trying to get, these are very complex issues, and the forget about security. We've talked about it with regard to government backdoors into stuff and so on and so forth. And in every case, it's getting Congress people to understand this at a level, right? Yeah. That they can actually legislate effectively. And, luckily we have people like Lindsey Graham who, really get it. He doesn't. Like, it just, and that's where I get so frustrated, is just seeing, watching C-SPAN. I'm the person who does, and watching these debates and just knowing that, like, they clearly don't understand the implications of what they're trying to legislate.
Do you need a cyber Congress? Do you need a cyber Congress? Do you need a Congress that is specifically there for digital?
Right,
digital,
and we've talked about it, Joe. And it needs to happen at more of a global level. It needs to be WHO. It needs to be, the world, some sort of much larger, because at the US level, it doesn't matter, because if there's some government that's in whatever, that's not going to enforce the laws, like you look at all of the attacks that come out of India, local law enforcement doesn't do much to punish the criminals in India. But they're attacking US citizens. It's like, it's just so difficult of an area. And that's where I think everything sort of, we can talk about it all day long, but until it's this global problem and there's no global defense force.
Yeah, I think at least, I mentioned previously, that at least the new kind of White House statement that came out did actually talk about, with the new funding around cyber, that they did talk about a cooperative, a transparency, a global effort, that no country can deal with this themselves as well. So I think that, maybe we do need a cyber type of Interpol as well, and that we go even beyond, as an international corporation to work in these, because again, it also gets into, were some of these companies multinational? Were they, based, headquartered in other countries? It just happened that its Exchange servers were based in the US. So I think absolutely. So Josh, just any final thoughts? If the FBI, I'm pretty sure somebody in the FBI, they're all probably listening to this call already anyway. So when they do listen to the live podcast, I mean, what would you recommend? If a future direction, from summarizing this up, because we're definitely not going to solve it here. Right. And I think this is a bigger debate. And I think absolutely, Mike, Congress needs to be brought up to speed and how to deal with this, because we've seen a lot of unknowledgeable people in Congress that don't know really how to ask the right questions. And I think this is always about asking the right questions will help you find the direction and solution. So Josh, any recommendations or pointers where we should be looking for the future to solve, or to at least come up with possible recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, from a cybersecurity professional perspective, to me, this just is a reminder that if we don't clean up after ourselves, like, the government's going to do it for us, and none of us want that. So it's just a reminder for us to have more resolve to take control of these systems, our own systems, secure them, build security into the products that we're putting into the market. Look, I spent a lot of time in the government, and I understand, like, by and large, the vast majority of folks that work for the federal government have really good intent, and they're really just trying to do their job, which is to try to keep folks safe and secure, right? I think there's a bit of messaging that could have been better here on this, and to my mind, and maybe there's some variation in the security community, but to my mind, when you take an overt action like this that really pushes the boundaries, you need to make a clear and compelling case that this is an exigent circumstance, that there is something about this particular incident that is so beyond normal and puts people at such a greater risk that you acknowledge that you're really stepping some boundaries here, and that this is a special circumstance, and you broadcast that wildly. Otherwise, people like us are going to freak out and say, look, is this the new normal? And rightly so. I mean, like we guard our freedoms and liberties, I think, for good reason.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I think this is really a communication issue in probably the most aspect of it. So, Mike, any final thoughts? Have we changed your opinion, or has it just been reinforced?
I mean, I think opinions evolve. I think at the end of it, nothing from my perspective. My general opinion about law enforcement and their role in all of this hasn't changed dramatically. But again, I agree. I think it's a communication problem first and foremost. I think there's things that even courts could be doing. I would love to see more specialization, like more, whether it's having resources available to the courts, like when these warrants come up, like who's making this decision? Who does the judge turn to figure out like what's the right course of action? Is this an actual existential threat, or is this something that the other side is just blowing out of proportion? And how do they figure all that out? So I think and I'm hopeful that at the similar that we're seeing in other parts of the country with regard to law enforcement and partnerships with like health services and others, so that when they're responding to what's not actually a criminal activity, they're maybe bringing a social worker along or whatever. I would just love to see that sort of expand more for all these different types of nuanced things where it's not law enforcement's like specialization. And I'm sort of optimistic that we'll get there. Probably not as quickly as I'd like. But yeah, I agree. It's a communication.
Yeah, communication is the foremost issue that I think it resulted here. And I think we all agree that the intentions and motives were in the right places. It just could have done with a bit more, let's say, diplomatic methods. Right. Probably as I would say it. But absolutely, Josh, it's been fantastic having you on the show again. Hopefully we can actually get you back on again soon, because it's always a fun and educational conversation for me as always. So
I would love it. Yeah, maybe we'll talk about hacking back.
Hacking back is always always the edgy conversation, that one. But absolutely. So for the audience, I hope this has been interesting. Hope you've getting up to date on what's been happening in recent news and trends. Hopefully, if anyone in the FBI or Congress is listening, we'd love to have the discussion with you as well. So do reach out to us if you'd like to have that conversation. Again, thanks for listening in. Check us out, 401 Access Denied, every 2 weeks. We're just trying to keep you up to date, keep you educated, and keeping you basically on trend and basically hopefully safe and secure as much as we possibly can. So again, thank you. All the best. Take care and goodbye.